March 1969. On a frozen stretch of the Ussuri River, Soviet officers thought Mao Zedong's fury was just propaganda until Chinese troops unleashed a sudden ambush, shattering an alliance and nearly triggering nuclear war. Why did Moscow misread every warning? What drove Beijing to risk everything for a scrap of ice? The answers begin with the moment trust between superpowers became open hostility. In mid-1960, the Soviet Union delivered a single-page order that would upend China's entire industrial future. Overnight, Moscow recalled nearly 1,400 of its technical specialists from Chinese factories, laboratories and construction sites. Work on hundreds of joint projects, steel mills, missile plants, even the nuclear weapons program stopped in their tracks. Unfinished reactors and half-built machinery lay abandoned as Soviet trains carried engineers and blueprints back across the border. For China, the loss was more than technical expertise. Soviet manuals, spare parts, and the promise of atomic parity vanished with the departing teams. In Beijing, officials scrambled to salvage what they could, but the sudden withdrawal left entire industries paralyzed. Mao Zedong's government, already reeling from the failures of the Great Leap Forward, now faced the reality of isolation. Soviet cables in Moscow's party archives record the recall as a matter of policy, but in China, the move was branded as betrayal. Factories that once ran on Soviet know-how fell silent. The abrupt break forced China to chart a new course rooted in self-reliance and suspicion. In the months that followed, Chinese leaders accused the Kremlin of sabotaging their revolution, fueling a wave of anti-Soviet rhetoric that would soon echo through every corner of the country. The bitterness of 1960 set the stage for a rivalry that would harden with every passing year, as ideological differences turned into open hostility. By 1963, the rift between Beijing and Moscow had spilled out of backrooms and into the glare of the world's presses. The Chinese Communist Party published its proposal concerning the general line of the international communist movement in June, a blistering 25-point indictment of Soviet policy. In the pages of Peking Review, Mao's circle accused Khrushchev of betraying Marxism, of abandoning revolution for détente with the West. The language was direct and punishing. Phrases like capitulationist and revisionist became routine, signaling a new willingness to air grievances in public rather than behind closed doors. The Kremlin fired back that November with an open letter from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It called out China's leaders for splitting the socialist camp and condemned Mao's radicalism as reckless. Soviet broadcasts denounced the Cultural Revolution as chaos, while Chinese editorials painted the USSR as a new imperialist threat. Each side accused the other of betraying the revolution's core ideals, fueling a propaganda war that reached deep into classrooms, radio waves, and party meetings. By 1964, the polemics had become a daily ritual. Chinese pamphlets circulated with titles like "Long Live Leninism" and "Down with Modern Revisionism." Soviet responses, sometimes printed in Pravda and rebroadcast across Eastern Europe, warned of Beijing's dangerous ambitions. The ideological feud hardened borders not just on maps, but in the minds of millions. For Mao, the struggle was personal, a fight to define the soul of communism itself. The words grew sharper, each pamphlet and broadcast pushing the two former allies farther apart, making reconciliation less likely with every passing month. Winter along the Ussuri River brought more than biting wind. On December 27, 1968, Soviet border guards spotted a column of Chinese troops moving across the ice near Zhenbao Island. The Soviets advanced in trucks and armored vehicles, expecting a show of force to be enough. Instead, they found themselves surrounded and beaten with rifle butts and shovels. The confrontation left several men bloodied, but both sides pulled back before shots were fired. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1969, another clash erupted. This time, the violence escalated. Border patrols exchanged gunfire. Chinese sources reported 28 wounded, with casualties on both sides. Each incident was logged in urgent cables to Moscow and Beijing, but the pattern was clear. Patrols that once exchanged wary glances now met with fists, clubs, and bullets. On the front lines, Soviet and Chinese commanders faced off across the frozen river, each side convinced the other was testing limits. The skirmishes multiplied, yet senior Soviet officers dismissed these confrontations as routine. Reports described them as isolated scuffles, not warnings of something larger. The reality on the ground, however, was shifting. Patrol leaders found themselves improvising under pressure, as the river ice became a stage for increasingly dangerous encounters. Moscow's border command entered 1969 with a quiet confidence. Internal memos from late the previous year described the likelihood of a large-scale Chinese attack as extremely low. Patrols along the Ussuri River followed standing orders: maintain presence, avoid escalation, and report any unusual movement. The intelligence branch, the GRU, tracked incidents but interpreted Chinese provocations as outbursts tied to the Cultural Revolution, not signs of an imminent offensive. This analytic bias shaped every layer of response. When Soviet border guards encountered Chinese troops near Zhenbao Island, they expected posturing or at worst a scuffle, never a coordinated assault. Outposts remained lightly manned despite rising tensions. A typical patrol on Zhenbao Island in early 1969 consisted of around 70 men, usually traveling in a single truck, sometimes with armored support nearby, but rarely on alert. Reinforcements were hours away. Soviet readiness reports in January and February noted the uptick in brawls and gunfire, but senior officers dismissed these as local disputes, not warnings of a deliberate trap. The doctrine stressed restraint, rooted in the belief that China's military, weakened by internal chaos, would pull back before risking real bloodshed. In this climate, the prospect of an ambush seemed remote until the first shots shattered the routine. Orders for a decisive confrontation traveled down the chain of command in late 1968 as the Shenyang military region drafted a plan to trap a Soviet patrol on the ice of Zhenbao Island. The proposal called for a tightly coordinated ambush with hundreds of Chinese border troops lying in wait. Approval rested with Beijing's top leaders. Mao Zedong, facing mounting pressure from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, saw the border as a proving ground, an opportunity to display resolve against an old ally turned rival. Lin Biao, now defense minister and Mao's chosen successor, played a central role. After the 7th plenum in 1968, Lin's authority over the military was unmatched. Together with Zhou Enlai, they reviewed the plan, weighing the risks of clashing with a nuclear superpower against the domestic rewards of a show of strength. The timing was no accident. The Ninth Party Congress loomed, and a successful confrontation could rally the party around Mao's line, marginalize dissent, and cement Lin Biao's standing as the architect of a victorious, ideologically pure army. Party narratives from the period describe the decision as a united front, with Mao, Lin, and Zhou all signing off on the operation. While no Politburo minutes or Mao's diary entries have been released, Chinese accounts consistently point to this top-level approval. The operation was conceived as a limited but lethal action, lure the Soviets onto ground. China claimed as its own, strike hard, then control the narrative by framing the clash as self-defense. Preparation began months in advance. Shenyang commanders mapped out Soviet patrol routines and rehearsed the ambush, selecting Zhenbao for its legal symbolism and tactical advantages. The island, sitting on the Chinese side of the main river channel, according to Beijing's maps, offered the perfect stage. Propaganda teams drafted protest notes and press releases in advance, ready to denounce Soviet invasion the moment shots were fired. Lethal force was authorized at the highest level, but the plan carried clear boundaries. No pursuit across the main river, no escalation beyond the immediate area. The intent was to inflict casualties and seize the upper hand, then deliver a message. China would no longer accept humiliation, and the People's Liberation Army, under Lin Biao's command, was prepared to bleed for its borders. As the winter deepened, Chinese troops received not just weapons and orders, but ideological indoctrination. Political commissars reminded them that their actions would echo far beyond the frozen river. In Beijing, the leadership waited for word from the frontier, convinced that a single, well-timed clash could reshape not just the border, but the future balance of power in the socialist world. Before dawn on March 2nd, 1969, the ice covering the Ussuri River hid nearly 1,000 Chinese troops, dug in and waiting. On Zhenbao Island, the wind carried only the crunch of boots and the low murmur of orders. At 9 in the morning, a Soviet patrol truck rolled onto the island, led by Captain Vitaly Bubanin. 70 border guards stepped out, following a route they had taken for months. The air was sharp, the routine familiar. Soviet doctrine called for presence, not confrontation. Most of the men carried rifles slung low, expecting another tense standoff at worst. Chinese patrol leader Zhou Dengguo and his men, concealed in snowdrifts and shallow trenches, watched the Soviets advance. The plan was precise, an ambush. Let the patrol cross deep into the kill zone, then spring the trap. At 9:17 in the morning, a single volley shattered the silence. Automatic weapons fire erupted from hidden positions, cutting down the lead Soviet ranks. Bubanin's account later described chaos, men dropping to the ice, return fire wild, shouts drowned out by gunfire. Within minutes, dozens of Soviets were hit. KGB logs recorded the initial casualties, at least 32 dead and 14 wounded. Radio calls for help crackled across the border. Soviet command scrambled reinforcements, 60 more troops, and 6 BTR-60 armored personnel carriers sped toward the island. The frozen river, once a buffer, became a highway for war. Chinese machine gunners and mortars targeted the vehicles as they broke onto the ice. Bubanin, wounded but refusing evacuation, tried to regroup survivors behind the armored hulls. The firefight intensified, bullets ricocheting off steel and ice alike. By 10 in the morning, the battle had drawn in over 200 men, with tanks and artillery massing on both banks. Control of Zhenbao Island shifted 8 times over the next 9 hours. Soviet tanks thundered forward, only to be met by Chinese anti-tank squads. At one point, a Soviet T-62 was disabled and abandoned, later towed away by Chinese troops for study. The ground was littered with spent cartridges, shattered equipment, and bodies. Chinese sources later buried 68 of their own on the riverbank. The cost was staggering. Soviet tallies counted 58 dead and wounded. Chinese reports claimed 29 killed, though later estimates suggest higher losses on both sides. The clash ended in stalemate, neither side able to hold the island for long. For the men who survived, the memory was raw, the suddenness of the ambush, the confusion of orders, the shock of close-quarters combat. Commanders on both sides found their assumptions broken. Routine had given way to disaster in less than an hour. The battle for Zhenbao Island was no longer a border scuffle. It was a warning, written in blood, that neither Moscow nor Beijing could ignore. In Moscow, the first reports from Zhenbao Island landed on the desks of the Soviet General Staff before the blood had dried on the ice. The initial confusion, who fired first, how many were dead, gave way to a single, chilling reality. Dozens of Soviet border guards had been killed in a matter of minutes. The Politburo convened an emergency session that night. Leonid Brezhnev, Defense Minister Andrei Grechko, and KGB Chief Yuri Andropov pored over dispatches, searching for signs that the clash was an isolated incident rather than the opening move in a larger campaign. Declassified TSAMO files show that within 24 hours, the General Staff began running wargame scenarios. Planners mapped out the consequences of a full-scale Chinese incursion across the Ussuri, calculating how quickly reinforcements could reach the Far East. Railway manifests logged the sudden redeployment of armored divisions from the western USSR to the border, a move that strained logistics and signaled a new sense of redeployment. A classified memo circulated among the Politburo on March 3rd outlined nuclear options for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The document, stamped "Top Secret," considered the use of tactical warheads against Chinese troop concentrations and even listed Beijing among potential targets. The language was clinical: casualty estimates, fallout projections, timelines for escalation, but the implications were unmistakable. For the first time, the Kremlin treated the border as a possible trigger for global war. General Staff summaries from March 1969, now declassified, reveal a sharp shift in posture. Orders went out to elevate the alert status of missile and bomber units in the Far East. Communications with the Pacific Fleet intensified, and contingency plans for mass civilian evacuation along the Amur and Ussuri rivers were quietly updated. Inside the Kremlin, senior officers debated the risks of escalation. Some argued for a swift, overwhelming response to deter further Chinese attacks. Others, recalling the lessons of Berlin and Cuba, warned that even a limited nuclear strike could spiral beyond control. The war games ran for days, each scenario ending with unacceptable losses on both sides. The Politburo minutes, sparse but direct, record a single conclusion: the Soviet Union could not afford to underestimate China again. The firefight on Zhenbao Island had forced Moscow to confront the real possibility of nuclear war over a frozen scrap of land and against a rival they had dismissed as reckless but weak. In the hours after the Zhenbao Island firefight, a flurry of coded messages moved across continents. At CIA headquarters in Langley, analysts pored over intercepted Soviet communications, noting the abrupt elevation of military readiness along the entire Far Eastern border. Satellite imagery and radio intercepts confirmed armored units shifting east, while Pacific Fleet activity spiked. American intelligence reports from March 1969 flagged the border as a new flashpoint, with one cable warning that the Soviets appeared to be treating the situation as a possible prelude to larger conflict. Inside the Chinese Foreign Ministry, diplomats drafted protest notes and coordinated with embassies in Europe and Asia. Official memos, later declassified, show Beijing's envoys instructed to frame the clash as pure self-defense, calling for global support against Soviet aggression. The language was sharp, but behind closed doors, Chinese officials weighed the risk of escalation. Zhou Enlai, balancing outrage with caution, pressed for rapid diplomatic outreach. As the world's press covered the border violence, American officials quietly took notice. National Security Council records from early March 1969 reference feelers from Beijing. Subtle hints passed through intermediaries in Pakistan and Romania. These signals, buried in diplomatic backchannels, suggested that China was open to discussing broader security arrangements, provided the United States recognized its vulnerability to Soviet pressure. For the first time, American policymakers considered the possibility that the rift between Moscow and Beijing could be more than a propaganda split. CIA assessments, drawing on foreign ministry leaks and intercepted Soviet orders, concluded that the Zhenbao crisis had forced China to look outward for security. The prospect of a two-front confrontation, with Soviet divisions to the north and American forces to the south, pushed Chinese leaders to reconsider old hostilities. Within weeks, US analysts documented a subtle but unmistakable change. Beijing's tone toward Washington softened while its warnings to Moscow grew sharper. In the shadow of a border battle, the groundwork for a new alignment was quietly being laid, one memo at a time. Today, the river between Russia and China remains heavily fortified, proof that old scars still shape new realities. As both nations expand their military presence and test each other's resolve, the lesson endures. Misreading an adversary's intentions can turn a border dispute into a global crisis. History's frozen standoffs remind us that deterrence is fragile, but mistrust is enduring. Share your thoughts on how these tensions echo in our world now.